Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's guest is Rose Perry, the founder and executive director of Social Creatures.
All right, good morning. I have 9:01. We will get going today. My name is Jennifer Hawksland, and I'm the CEO at New York Bio. We're thrilled you're here to join us for another virtual breakfast. We have Dr. Rose Perry with us this morning, and I think it's particularly appropriate that we're going to talk about social connections, especially in the COVID that's in the rearview mirror, and probably COVID that's in our front view as we head into fall. A special thank you to VWR, our partner on lab supplies and all things needed to outfit your research activities. So we really appreciate our partnership with them and their sponsoring of our webinar. Housekeeping, as always, please ask your questions for us in the Q&A or the chat feature. Derek and I will get to those as we go through our discussion with Rose this morning. And with that, I will turn it over to Derek to do a better introduction of Rose, and then we look forward to the conversation. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. Rose, good morning. It is wonderful to have you here. And I'm really excited to talk about Social Creatures because I remember when the first time I had actually heard of the idea, it was in the middle of COVID. And just basically the idea around improving social connectivity, how that impacts our health, et cetera. It seemed like a great idea at the right time. And we're going to get into that. But before we do, we usually tend to have a little bit of an origin story with our guests. So if you could, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are?
Sure. Thanks for having me, first of all. It's my pleasure to be here. And so my background, I have a PhD in neuroscience and physiology. So pretty like hardcore science, which I got from New York University School of Medicine. And then after getting my PhD, I spent 4 years doing a postdoctoral fellowship at NYU's Institute for Human Development and Social Change. So I did a pretty hard shift from rodent models, really focusing on early life stress and adversity and how that influences brain and physiological development across the lifespan, into these human longitudinal research models that continued to be focused on child development and developmental psychobiology, but also had a very heavy population health component as well. And as a postdoc, I spent a lot of time also working not just in humans, but I worked in cross-species research very intentionally. So a lot of my studies in tandem had a rodent component and a human component. And I was really trying to understand how context, and context especially related to social context, social relationships, can get under the skin, so to speak, to influence physiological development. So by pairing human and rodent developmental research in tandem, I could really study these mechanisms, but within human context, to try to make sure that it remained as ecologically relevant to the human condition as possible. And there's a few people who are doing this, but it is pretty rare to be working in both species at a time. So in terms of the subject matter of my research, like I mentioned, I've really focused a lot on the influence of early life stress, trauma, and adversity, and how that intersects with social context. So how parent-child interactions are influenced in those contexts, and also how we can leverage relationships, whether that be through a parent or guardian or through peer relationships, to buffer against the effects of stress exposure and to repair the effects of stress. We've looked at this pretty extensively, both in the human and rodent model. So that's kind of what, like, subject matter wise led me to Social Creatures. I think we can go into the origins of Social Creatures a bit more, but I can pause for now. But that's just my research background.
Sure, and we'll get there. So my big thing here is, when you start with a rodent model, it's usually it's obviously devoid of human context, right? You have things that are remarkably well controlled. You're usually looking for either changes in stress hormones or anything like that. And Then when you get to humans, I imagine it gets a lot more complex, right? Because now you're dealing with real people, and these are not control subjects. Certainly not when you're talking about kids, when you're talking about stress and those kind of things. So how hard is it to really kind of make your, not so much make your conclusions match, but how hard is it to basically draw conclusions that are concordant between one and the other? Is it really, do you find yourself in a lot of gray areas or whatever? Because in looking at some of the things you've done, there's been a lot of things that have actually been consistent between both models.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's definitely tricky. I often compare cross-species research to doing a really complicated jigsaw puzzle where you're like, you don't even know the pieces you're missing sometimes. But I have been surprised with my own research how things have come together. I've learned along the way what can help with that translational process. I have found that starting with as much knowledge as possible about the human condition and human context before designing the rodent studies is one really major thing that might seem obvious, but before I had human experience myself, it wasn't as easy to be an expert at that. It was based just on reading, but really when I came together and spoke with human researchers and then became one myself, the rodent questions became more relevant and therefore more, I think, likely to align. Also, I think I'm always constantly surprised by how similar we are to rodents in some ways. We both are incredibly social species. So I think that element, it's just a act of being a mammal in many ways. And then also, I think there's a lot of caution you need to take when interpreting across species. I think we certainly always want to consider what makes sense within the ecological niche of each species. So how we would measure our variable of interest in a human versus a rodent looks very different. How we would think about the ages is very different in terms of development. But where I think we've been able to draw conclusions is when we look at things in terms of a process rather than like very specific data that we're comparing. So like, what is the developmental process that unfolds and how does the presence or absence of social relationships or modulation of the quality and quantity of that influence those processes? And when you try to compare processes, that becomes less daunting and perhaps more relevant than when you're really just comparing like very specific graphs in the human to graphs in the rat. So that's kind of how I've approached it. And it's worked out well for most of my studies.
Yeah. So how long have you had the idea for social creatures? Is this something that was, kind of born during COVID? Was it something that you figured out that you kind of had to do, or was it something that had been baking for a while?
Yeah, so good question. It's a combination of a slow bake and a fast burn. So I definitely knew through my research that I was growing increasingly impatient with not feeling enough like my research was having an immediate impact in people's lives. I know that this is a feeling that many academics go through. I was really feeling it towards the end of my postdoc. I loved what I was doing, but I kind of started feeling like one of my lab rats where I was like caged up a bit and not really interacting in the real world enough. So I knew by the end of my postdoc that I wanted to explore a non-traditional academic trajectory that was a little bit more focused on impact first or impact-driven discovery. I was also just constantly, this sounds corny, but constantly in awe by some of the learnings. And I wanted to make sure that the learnings of my own research and others was reaching the context and the people who I think it would benefit the most. And I think we have a ways to go with creating those pipelines from laboratory to real world settings. So that was kind of the general motivation. So I knew I wanted to start some sort of applied research impact-driven organization by the end of my postdoc, which was, I told my advisors sometime in 2019, I'm not going to go on the job market. I'm going to just do something. And they were so supportive for me giving very little detail. This sort of applied research startup. And my postdoc wasn't going to end until like the middle of 2020, and there was possibility of extending it. But then when COVID hit, I kind of knew it, like in a night, I was like, oh, the Applied Research Organization, we're going to call it Social Creatures. And it, I've always been passionate about getting the social neuroscience findings into real world settings. This is the time, like if there was ever a time to be doing this, it's now. So we pretty much, I think I stayed up for like 48 hours straight and made our website and just kind of reached out to colleagues and said, who wants to do this with me? Like, we're moving fast because this is obviously social distancing and quarantine. We've been studying the effects of the lack of this and the benefits of it for many years. So it was something that was near and dear to our hearts collectively. So yeah, that's the long story short of how Social Creatures came to be. And we sprinted all of 2020. I will say that it was a sprint.
How did you, so clearly, you, like you said, you had been thinking about it, right? And about the impact that an organization like what you're developing could have. How did you, in your 48 hours of no sleep, how did you decide who to reach out to first? How, right? Like, how did you develop the actual plan for the organization? Because obviously a lot of our audience are entrepreneurs as well, going through similar things.
Yeah, so I will say that, the plan was not fully formulated at the time that I was reaching out to people. It became pretty solidified within like 8 weeks of launching. But I just thought, who is high passion that I know that also knows about the scientific research and the backings of the importance of social connection and social isolation. We also, I should say, we launched with equity concerns. That was what really motivated me to stay up for 48 hours, was that I knew that the effects of social isolation and quarantining would not impact everybody equally. And I worked quite heavily with low income populations in my postdoctoral research. I just really felt compelled to make sure that we were trying to provide some sort of social safety net to more vulnerable populations in this instance. So just reaching out to peers, I leveraged my existing network. I had many conversations with other academics before that had shared, I want to be doing more to have immediate impact. We need to get this information out. And then it's also worth mentioning that I also reached out to like nonprofit community partners and industry partners that I had formed through a postdoctoral and PhD work. Because I had always kind of had some sort of side hustle in science communication or philanthropic consulting, because applied research has always been a passion of mine. So I kind of just, went down my list of people and networks. And once I saw who showed up, then it became even more clear, okay, how are we going to operate? Like, we knew what our mission was, which was to make sure that anyone could stay socially connected, no matter their circumstances, as we entered quarantine and social isolation. So having that mission solidified is what allowed all of us to align and then figure out, okay, what is this going to look like operationally, as we, went from more of a sprint and more to a sustainable operational model.
So can you talk a little bit about the actual model? So what are kind of the main pillars of what you do, and what are kind of some of the ways that you're trying to drive impact with that operational model?
Yeah, so we have right now 3 major pillars of our operation, which is education, advocacy, and impact-driven programmatic applications. So we have education and advocacy. A lot of that is around just increasing public awareness around the science of social connection, increasing awareness around the fact that there are what we call social connectedness gaps. There are equity concerns to social connection, that this is a resource, somewhat like financial resources, having access to social capital. There's an equity component there. And we do a lot of that through our website. We have an online newsletter called The Creature Times, where we do a lot of our science communication and dissemination of what the research says in very lay-friendly communication. And we also have very advocacy leaning articles. And then we give talks and presentations that we presented to the Social Security Administration on the impact of the psychological impact of COVID on children and families. So just really trying to get the word out there. And the third major pillar where we spend a lot of our time, increasingly so, is our design labs, which is this impact-driven arm where we are designing applied science. I don't love the word intervention, but programs, solutions, where we're really trying to take what we know from research and apply it to real world context when we identify that there are areas of social connection gaps. How can we create a solution? And a really important part of how we do this, there's this applied research component where we're trying to integrate learnings from the lab into practice, but we're also doing this directly in tandem with communities on the ground. So it's this yin and yang where we're also, like, some of our guiding principles is we don't ever identify solely the social connectedness gap or the problem that we're trying to create a solution for. That has to come from the community somehow. So we have a lot of focus groups. We talk to a lot of people to understand where that occurs. And then what the solution looks like, we co-design with the community as well. And that has, I cannot stress how much that's helped us rapidly launch things that has actually been useful to people, because I think a lot of the research, while we definitely want to get it out there, was not designed with the community in mind, and definitely not underrepresented communities. So there's also this discovery phase of how to make that science work in unique, specific social context, and how can we learn from that and then feed that back into research, right? So that we're creating this feedback loop, so that the laboratory research over time hopefully does become more relevant and more equity concerned from the earliest stages of its conception.
So can you give, Rose, can you give us an example? Because all this is helpful, but it's relatively abstract.
Yes.
Can you give us a case study for what you've, like, when you've already gone into, you've done your focus groups, you've developed, and then actually deployed solutions?
Exactly. I can totally do that. So our earliest design lab program launched in May of 2020. So I'll use that as a case study. It's called Fitness, which kind of stands for Seated Fitness. And what we had done was in April, we were doing focus groups. We were looking to speak with populations that from research would suggest are prone to social isolation even ahead of the pandemic. So we wanted to see how they were faring. So we had focus groups with individuals who had a spinal cord injury and kind of trying to understand if they were feeling more lonely, more isolated, what was helping, what was hurting. And the biggest thing that was coming through across focus groups was feeling injustice over the fact that non-disabled peers that they were living with could now take Equinox classes in the home on Zoom. And there was never anything accessible for them in terms of exercise. And now it was like blaringly in their face how inaccessible it was.
Right.
Yep.
And we came away from that and we're like, wow, I did not think that I would ever be leading some sort of exercise program here. But gyms and place to congregate are a perfect example of creating opportunities for social connection and belongingness. And it also is a nice way to not brand it as here's a social connection solution where there could be some stigma attached. It's like, I'm coming for this really cool exercise. So we pretty quickly created a Zoom-based fitness program. We have we wanted to make it compete with Equinox. So we have some pretty awesome instructors. We have Lindsey Vaughn, Olympic skier's personal trainer. We have David Beckham's personal trainer as an instructor, many other amazing instructors. And we've had a class a week since May of 2020. We now are working up, we have some weeks 2 classes a week. And we, through our interactions and how we run the class, have been inserting social neuroscience principles and learnings. And we have impact data that shows that 94% of our participants report that their quality of life has improved since starting fitness. So during the pandemic, their quality of life improved. which tells you how horrible access and accommodation was for this population before the pandemic. So that's one example, and I can give a very brief other one that we're at the earlier stages of developing, we're still designing, where there's quite a bit of co-design with the community, is we're creating a first-time parent support program, or transition program, I should say, just because through, again, surveys, focus groups, we've identified that this is a particularly vulnerable time for feeling isolated. And we are basically creating a modernization of Australia's model for first-time caregivers, where when you give birth to a child, you receive a letter in the mail, and they assign you to a parent group with other parents who've given birth within the same 4 weeks as you and live within a 1 to 2 mile radius of you. And you come together, you get to know each other. There's a maternal health nurse there to answer any questions around child development, maternal health, but really the goal is to create these networks. And in Australia, there's a ton of data that shows how enduring and strong the relationships formed are in these groups, and how that has downstream benefits to the child's health and to society. So we are creating our version of that in New York, and we're working directly with first-time and expected caregivers to design the program. And that will hopefully be piloting in 2022.
That's really cool. We had a question that I think is relevant here, and just for everyone, I'm going to put one of the posts from your website into the chat, because it really goes through a lot of the background of what you do. It has links to the science of what you do, and it's really interesting, because this is one of these ideas where if you gave someone this idea without any context of the science or whatever, especially during COVID, people would say, "Oh, that sounds like a really, really good idea." And this is something that also has a lot more behind it. So the question, which hit on some of the things that you just talked about, was, have you thought about partnering with nonprofits that serve vulnerable populations, such as families living in homeless shelters or veterans with ADD, women's in abuse centers, et cetera? And he said these populations with other underlying challenges may feel the impact of COVID more than others. So you talked a little bit about this, but is this something where you are kind of actively looking for other groups to partner with you? And if they do actually hear about it, how do they kind of reach out and find you? What does that germination process look like?
Yeah, so I will start off by saying that working through community partners is a guiding principle of ours. So how we have these focus groups, how we disseminate all of our programs really is through community partners. And we do that by design. CBOs and community embedded organizations, they have strong trusted relationships with the communities that we often are trying to serve. And we're practicing what we preach in terms of social relationships and social connection, and leveraging that to have faster uptake of the services. So yes, we are always looking for more partners. We are mostly right now looking for partners for our existing programs, which are SITNES, our new parent support transition program, which will launch next year, which of course we want to make sure that we're reaching even more vulnerable parents in that situation. We also have a generational youth mentorship program where we are pairing a teen mentor with an elementary school age child to provide one-on-one social emotional support and academic support. The teens are trained in trauma-informed learning and how to really show up socially and emotionally first for their mentee before getting into more the academic side of things. So we're really in scaling mode with those programs, but I'd say within the next, 2022, we'll start looking on what's the next initiative, because we are operating kind of as this incubator accelerator where we want to always be designing a new solution and then partnering with scaling partners to help us scale it while we transition then to monitoring and evaluating those programs. And to reach out, you can on our website, which is, Derek just linked it, but thesocialcreatures.org. There's a contact form, and my email, which is rose@thesocialcreatures.org. Send an email. I will definitely see it and I'll definitely reply.
So do you
I'll post that too.
For the volunteers, right? So those are coming from the organizations with whom you partner, or if this, conversation, really speaks to some of our audience, I mean, could they volunteer to participate in one of your programs? How does that work?
Yeah, we have quite a few volunteers who just reached out through our website. So we're still in startup mode because we're a year and a half, not even a year and a half old. So yeah, you could volunteer in any capacity for us. And then, yeah, we also work, I wouldn't say that our volunteers necessarily come from other, like our partnering organizations. They're treated as a partnership. So we work pretty collaboratively on creating the programs, and to the point where, like the Generational Youth Mentorship Program is a collaboration between Social Creatures, Steam Park Inc., which is a nonprofit that works a lot with lower income families and children, and then Mount Sinai's Children's Abilities Research Center. So you'll see that all of our programs have many players, and that is by design. And we're just trying to bring together those partners that will allow us to innovate more quickly and to reach people more quickly.
Yeah.
So as you're doing all of these kind of partnered programs, I imagine that one of the things that you think about is how you eventually disseminate the results, right? I mean, one of the advantages of your background is that you've done this from a research perspective already. And is this something where you can kind of continuously do things to either publish in an actual academic journal, or kind of show the community that it works, right? It's one of the things where a lot of times when you're working with communities like this, everyone feels like they've done some useful. It feels like it works for the end user, but how do you kind of show everyone the actual real results? How do you show people that it works?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we've been working on. Definitely our first priority is to disseminate without any paywalls, without any barriers to understanding what's going on. So we're using our Creature Times newsletter and our social media to report on impact and evaluation findings. Eventually, we'll be working on white papers to have a more formal description of a lot of that. But it is a strategic goal of ours also, when appropriate, when we feel that the impact and evaluation is something that would be relevant to other researchers, to then take that, actually approach it as research and publish it in peer-reviewed journals. So we're really trying to balance both of them as we grow. But our top priority is always going to be, how can we provide that immediate feedback to the communities that we are working with directly.
So we had another question here in terms of, improving connections with people with physical and mental impairments in the larger society. What is the most impactful way to spend government funding? So in addition to kind of what you're doing, I suppose the big question is, what are some of the things that are that between the government, the health system, et cetera, what are some of the things that we could or should be doing a little bit better on this front?
Yeah, in terms of physical and mental impairments and government spending, I could go for a while on this. I think there's quite a bit of policy changes that need to be made. I don't want to go too much in depth with it, but I will say that the way that Social Security for individuals with disability is set up is that you almost have to stay living in poverty to even benefit at all from government assistance, which means that if you do have a significant impairment, even if you get married or you have certain dependents, you no longer qualify for your benefits, which I think we really need to look into that as a group and advocate for changes on that front. In terms of mental health, also, there's quite a bit that I think needs to be done with parity laws, especially as a lot of mental and physical health care has become remote, the telemedicine. I think that's here to stay in some component. And parity laws are basically laws that say whether clinicians get equal reimbursement for virtual versus in-person healthcare. And there is not parity in all states in that reimbursement. And if you're getting reimbursed less for virtual healthcare, then the clinician is not as incentivized to provide
They're
that.
going to do less of it.
And I will tell you from our work that we have seen many vulnerable families, the reason they can't engage is because they don't have a car, or they can't, childcare is too complicated. Like being able to access services in their home through telemedicine. And like we have Digital Safety Nets initiative where we have spoken to some of these individuals, given them computers, internet. That's not the barrier, but they can't afford / have access to the services they need in the home. So those are just two examples. But yeah, I think we need to make some sweeping policy change here to really make a difference in terms of how should we be spending government money. And then also just universal design. I mean, the ADA has helped quite a bit, but we still have a long way to go in terms of creating an infrastructure that is equitable, and that physical infrastructure is key to being able to come together and connect and to participate fully in society as well. So just really examining, I mean, I notice more and more where there are not curb cuts, where there are not ramps, especially in New York City. I mean, it's awful, the accessibility of subway stations, and universal design benefits everybody. Like if there were more curb cuts, if there were more elevators in subway stations, that doesn't just benefit individuals with mobility differences, it benefits busy parents with strollers, right? So like there's so much
It
there.
does.
Yeah.
So that's another way I think we should be spending government money a bit differently than we have been.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that the pandemic has highlighted is in many ways a lot of the, not just the last mile problem in terms of getting healthcare to patients, but really just the last mile problem in terms of so many things, how to get to the place that you're supposed to be. You know, what are you supposed to do with your kids that are there if your kids are in virtual school? And that's another huge element that we need to think about in terms of how do people get done what they need to get done. In many ways, the school day represents the time where your kids are actually taken care of if they are in an actual school. If they're not, you have a whole other set of stresses on your time and your ability to go anywhere. And it's something that is, admittedly probably, 2, 3, 4 down the list after, are we actually providing a decent educational environment for our kids? But it's one of these things that is definitely going to have an impact.
100%. Yeah, it's definitely something I think that has been raised in our collective consciousness as we've experienced COVID. And I do see some hope because of that. I see, even in the infrastructure bill that has been proposed, there's a lot around childcare and alleviating stress for caregivers and making access to these things more equitable. So I hope we see that occur. The child tax allowance that is active, where there's, I think it's like 300, there's some nuances, but you get like $300 of money per child. We've done a whole analysis on how we really strongly feel, based on the research on cash transfers, that's going to improve opportunity to connect with kids and one another and have like really tons of cascading positive effects on kids and families. So I guess all to say is this has really, hopefully there's some silver lining to be had from this, where this is serving as a push for change in a positive direction.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So what do you see? So like, I know last year it was a huge scramble, right? For school districts, for families, for everyone to try and, if they didn't have internet, to get, sort of internet capable, like devices to kids and try to do all that. It seems that most schools this year are planning to be in person, right, without digital class offerings. How do you think that will impact long term? And do you think we still need to be building this ability to have the digital connection, even if the kids are back in the classroom in sort of a normal circumstance?
Yeah, I was quite frankly kind of surprised to see that New York was going to full in person again. I was a little disappointed. I understand this is nuanced. I don't envy the leaders making these decisions. Like, I have a lot of empathy for them. But what was nice about having that tech component is that we were really starting to lean into the universal design for learning. There are some kids that were thriving learning from home. Of course, it was very challenging for some and very challenging for many families, but that also was very good for some kids. And having that flexibility to engage, I think is super important. I mean, I know I personally have a disability. I, in 5th grade, missed months of school. And if I would have been able to stay connected with technology at the time, that would have been huge. And that's just one example of many that I know are ongoing. So I understand not wanting to make things so complicated for teachers. Teachers have been through so much, but I do hope that school districts don't stop working on how do we create a model where when kids can't be here, they can still participate as fully as possible. We've learned a lot of how that can work through responding to the pandemic. So how do we build this into a permanent model to be a more resilient community, even just on an individual level, or if there are more public health disasters or other major crises, which eventually is bound to happen, right? So I'll be interested to see what happens. Every state is also dealing with it differently. So New York is one example where we're going back pretty full force in person. I have equity concerns over that, but we'll be able to compare how that's going versus other locations that are maintaining hybrid models. So I think this is a huge opportunity to learn, and I hope that we continue to treat it as such, and we keep our eyes on the goal of how do we build a more connected, resilient school experience for everybody.
Is there a policy piece of that too, right? So and I don't want to go too far in the weeds, but the first thing I think of is if students are fully virtual, will the school district get the credit, the monies to support those students that aren't in the classroom? Is that a component? I literally don't, I'm failing at my lawyerly requirement to know the answers to every question. I literally don't know the answer to that question.
I don't either, to be quite honest, but I would imagine that is a huge, I know that even getting the funds and orchestrating, getting computers and everything out was a massive lift. To say these things that I'm saying does require, I think, massive policy change in some regard. It's not just, the onus shouldn't be on the individual school, right? The school has to be supported in some way to be able to enact a universal design policy for how their students engage. But I personally don't know the weeds of that, but I'm going to look into it now. So good question.
This is kind of, we're highlighting one of the reasons that we really wanted to talk to you, and one of the reasons that I think it's really important, because as we transition back to whatever the forward model is going to be, as we just highlighted, they're going to do their best, right? They have reasons for what they want to do, and they're trying to put forward the best solution that they can, and invariably that solution is probably not going to work for everybody, right? There are going to be equity concerns. There are going to be groups that it doesn't work quite as well here. And not to put too much pressure on your shoulders, but you guys have built something now where when those things come up, you have a way to say, okay, how can we actually approach this from a design standpoint? How can we actually think about solutions? And I think that's one of the reasons it's really important, I think, to get your message out there. And another thing to think about is, again, we've talked about scale, and getting solutions from that germinate in New York and basically taking them to other communities that are either similar or experiencing similar problems, I think is going to be really important. So I mean, you had mentioned some of the focus groups you've done on folks with spinal cord injury. I know that Mount Sinai has a great program there. Is there the ability to kind of take those learnings and connect with other centers around the country? Right, because I think one of the things that we'll find is that there are a lot of groups everywhere that experience the same problems as everybody else.
Agreed, and that's a great question. That's definitely a goal of ours, and we're working on that now on the individual level, because what's pretty cool about when you have these tech-based solutions, so long as you have you're thinking about it holistically, like we give computers and internet out because the digital divide is a thing. But as long as you can have this tech-based component, we designed our programs with New York in mind, but there are far more than New Yorkers already using our programs because it's kind of spread on its own. In our Sitness group, we have people from different countries and all different states, like many different states. So we're learning from individual level impact data, how this is influencing people in different contexts and scenarios, amongst the backdrop of different policies. Some states have had like heavier mask and social distancing policies than others. So we are looking at that. And then the goal is to create this multiplying impact model where we can say to another organization, here's how you create Sitness. Like, here are the pieces, just go and do it. And like, we're here to help, but we want to create the playbook for all of our programs to scale beyond New York and then learn how that has worked or what needs to tweak to make it work in different contexts and understand why that's the case as we scale.
Just as another point of information for you, for your spinal cord research, if you haven't connected with the people at the Shepherd Center in Atlanta, I can make a connection. My dad severed C5-6 and was there. And so it's an amazing facility and they do a lot of research there as well. So
incredible. We would love that connection. Yeah. Thank you.
And that's talking about scaling it elsewhere to, and getting input for different regions as well.
Yeah, that would be incredible. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the it's interesting in doing this series, we've actually spent a lot of time on telehealth, on how to reach patients, and on a lot of the challenges that we face, whether they're technological or otherwise, just because there is this glaring need, and it's because of the situation that we were in, everyone now, I hope, pays more attention, right? And have you seen that? I think I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about when you do research, you have kind of a small community that all kind of understands the same things and they understand the data. Have you seen a little bit more kind of pervasive feeling, whether it's empathy, whether it's understanding or curiosity, now that you've started this? Are people a little bit more receptive to the types of things that you're doing?
Yes and no. Yes, last year, 100% yes last year, as things have gotten better. So when everyone was in quarantine, when things were really scary and distant, was way more attention than we ever would have expected in a good way. And I think it was really, raising awareness and bringing people together in a very powerful way. We've seen, unfortunately, a steep drop off of that this year. It's not that it's with everybody, but I think as soon as the world started opening up a bit more and the problem wasn't impacting everyone directly, that empathy bridge was a little bit lost. Not for everyone, but I was a little disappointed that was the case. That I think we tend to forget things fast, and in some ways that's probably from what we know about stress and trauma, a protective mechanism. So I say that with complete understanding, but I do want to encourage folks to reflect on this is not better for everybody, and also a lot of the issues that made quarantine hard for more privileged people have existed forever for others since before the pandemic. So we really need to actually come together and make sure that people can participate more fully in society and build these bridges to connection, because this isn't a pandemic specific problem. I mean, I think if anything, the pandemic has kind of helped us get the word out and raise awareness around that. And I just want to make sure that we don't lose that. And at the very least, if we can keep programmatic changes running, like even if people's empathy levels kind of drop, if we can keep policies like schools give out computers to kids that don't have any, and families that don't have any, and you can engage in an exercise program from your home, you can engage in mental health services from your home. I really hope that at least those policy exceptions that came about will be ingrained into day-to-day operations as we continue to return. I mean, I don't know what's happening anymore with the pandemic, but as we eventually get back to normal.
Let's hope so. But I think too, even when we think about the discussion around vaccines, right? We still have to keep in mind folks with either autoimmune conditions or, we do have groups of people where, not everything is an easy solution, and there are actually challenges for, access, et cetera. So we seem to have a lot of kind of 80-20 thinking at the moment, where when a lot of people fall into the 80 group, they kind of think the job is done and the last 20% is easy. But, as we see with everything else, the last mile is really important. So the last mile of folks where, either the vaccines aren't the best solution for them, or we do still have to be careful. That's the way that we kind of get everybody out of the situation, as opposed to, being, almost done at 80%.
Well, I know you also think that, I mean, I'm hopeful, right? Like, I'm still hopeful the pandemic has, increased the interest in science, right? For careers for students. And I'm hopeful that then when Rose, you're talking about the programs you're developing for populations that their isolation has nothing to do with the pandemic, that empathy, right, reflects that people can understand now what these people are facing, which maybe they couldn't understand as well beyond intellectually before they too were, sort of locked down and in quarantine.
Yeah, I definitely think that's been going on. It was just so strong in 2020. I'm like, let's keep that up, guys. Like, let's keep that empathy high. And in terms of science, I definitely have seen, even from undergraduate students, master's students, different students I've mentored and taught classes to, just a greater thirst to have more impact with their science as well. Like I'd mentioned earlier, I think that that's something that academics commonly feel, but I think that that's been escalated, and then also like taking action on those feelings has increased. So not just kind of sitting with that and hemming and hawing, what do I do about this? I think I've seen more folks just mobilize in the sciences as well, which has been really cool.
So, so how do we keep this up? Right. I think there's always going to be I think there's now going to be probably a more permanent, vocal aspect of the community, but how do we not lose the 80%? How do we get to kind of that middle of the bell curve that does want to just kind of snap back to normal? And how do we not so much not let that happen, but how do we keep some of the empathy, or at least, kind of keep some of that curiosity about how other people are doing?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, well, there's a few different ways to attack this, right? And I think about this a lot. I think that the part of the reason it was so strong in 2020 was because it was so visible to so many in 2020. So how do we keep up visibility of equity concerns and differences? And, if we use disability as an example, where I think there's no argument that this world is not yet designed for people with disabilities to be able to fully and equally participate. So therefore, they don't have equitable opportunities to form social connections. How can we make disability more visible? Because it's a conundrum where if the world is designed so you can't participate, then non-disabled people aren't seeing disabled folks as much and not thinking about the equity concerns, right? So I think getting fitness into gyms where people are like, what is fitness? And are like, I hurt my foot. I can't work out. That's frustrating. Oh, I can do fitness. Why was this even created? This is great. It helped me. Like, I think if we can make things more visible in people's lives, that's going to keep empathy alive and help move these policy, like pressure for policy and programmatic changes. That's just one example. I think a lot about it in terms of visibility, though. I think that alone is huge. I do believe in the good of humanity, and I think we've shown in COVID that we can come together and organize and do great things if we are mission aligned. So it's just making sure people even understand the issue to begin with. Yeah, those are my initial thoughts on that.
Okay, I mean, one of the big things here is I think you almost need kind of a bullhorn of exposure, right? You need to kind of keep being consistent. You need to find people that are going to keep listening and find ways to keep engaging with people. One of the things that I'm really encouraged by is I think the power of, storytelling from small groups is a great way to kind of get that out there. So any advances you can make in either the spinal cord injury community, or in other potentially underserved poverty stricken communities or anything like that, I think those can really be used as a model to to kind of replicate those results. And I would ask, so you mentioned a little bit before about how you have a number of folks on your team that are volunteering. How do you see kind of growing the organization, and how does the economics work now? How do you get more people kind of permanently involved in the organization?
Yeah, so it depends on each program, right? But it depends on the phase of each program. But basically, in terms of education and advocacy, we're just trying to produce more, just build capacity so that we can produce more, because I think that this education and awareness and visibility piece alone is huge. Having stories on our social media, testimonials from real people, we just, as simple as more boots on the ground that we can get there with content creators, that will kind of take care of itself. And then in terms of the program design, that's a bit more intricate. The overarching model here is to design something with our in-house expertise, pilot it in-house with our partnerships involved, but then kind of pass it off to a scaling entity. So, if someone like Equinox was like, we want to take fitness, we're super open to that. And the thing is, we don't know what it's going to look like yet. We're open to it staying a nonprofit, is spinning it off as a nonprofit and then growing it. But we're also open to how can it just be mass adopted into existing fitness industries, right? Or Peloton or someone take it over.
I was just going to say Peloton needs a new team of instructors, and they need a fitness instructor, and they need a flashy new commercial. I don't know how they're going to do it. They now have the thing where they have the people running through the woods, and that all seems exciting. There's probably another segment of the community where they say, come sit on your couch, we're going to work out, and people are going to be like, yeah, I think that's perfect for me. I don't want to run through the woods, but there's some Netflix and exercise that I want to get done.
Yeah, and it's still hard sitting down. I'll be warned. It's not easier sitting down with something that I learned. It's in some ways harder. But yeah, we're really trying to create these solutions that are grounded in science and community participation, and then spin them off so they can be scaled. Our role as social creatures will always be to be designing those solutions and then monitoring them as they're scaled, taking those learnings back to our communities, to researchers that it would be of interest to, and then refining and creating new things. And then through that, this is already happening with some of our partnerships. That's how we're generating revenue streams, through those partnerships and spin-offs. So it is flexible by design, because when you design these programs, you don't really know where they're going to go originally, and you have to be okay with that uncertainty. But yeah, that's the basics of the model.
So you said obviously you start in-house, right? And it takes 15 seconds to look at the website and see your advisors and those that are engaged and recognize the level of expertise that you've assembled. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
But how do you decide what's next? What is your process for determining where you spend your human and financial capital next?
Yeah, so that's why right now we are on, so 2020 was a sprint where we were like, this is where we're hearing from our focus groups the greatest needs are. So we honed in on disability, youth and learning contexts, and new parents, and then the foundational program of making sure everyone has internet and technology so they can engage in these services. So we said this year we're not taking on anything new, because we want to see these through and scale. I think we'll take on one new thing a year, and we just continue to always be doing our focus groups and such. So it's guided by science who we decide to talk to, and then we, based on where the need is the greatest, is how we'll decide to take something on new. And then from that, we have ongoing strategy meetings for all of our existing programs to say, this is how we can take fitness to the next level. This is how we can take the youth mentorship program to the next level. Here's where we need to bring resources in. Like with fitness, we're building right now an entire user engagement team to really help with the scaling process of that, just for example. So we have a strategy committee that meets weekly that guides all of these decision-making processes.
What about the reverse? What if now a nonprofit that's working, we'll take the spinal cord injury community, comes to you and says, hey, like, we love your fitness program, but we have had this other program and we think it needs like help, right? We need some expertise. Like, would you all consider helping another potential partner to work on something they have existing as well?
Yes, so long as it's mission aligned, then yes. And we're doing that right now. I can give an example with our partnership with NABU, which is a nonprofit their mission is to eradicate illiteracy in developing countries. And they create incredible storybooks for kids in mother tongue languages that are typically not used to produce children's storybooks. Right. And they reached a stage of their organization where they have lots of people who are on the app. It's an app-based program because smartphone penetration is really high in developing countries these days. And it's just easier than going through the print route. But they want to increase engagement on the app. And we met with them about it. And based on the science of learning, we know that learning in kids especially occurs through social interactions. And we're helping them right now really explore the social context in which their users are using the app, identifying strengths and leverage points to encourage healthy reading habits. And it's really all about building social connection between caregivers, siblings, and kids that are learning to read as the driver of engagement with their products. So that's an example of, they kind of came to us. We said we can do it like kind of an audit with you. And if it has anything to do with social connection, then if we have capacity, we're game. So we are interested in that. And also, like, a lot of times people have come to us and there's a component of the program that we built that would be helpful for their existing program. So we're also okay with like piecemealing it a bit. This is what we learned about just increasing engagement in general based on the principles of social neuroscience, and that can apply to many different programs, regardless of the application and the population you're trying to serve.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of the beauty of an impact organization, right? Where, you know, you don't feel like you have to own the solution. You simply want the solution to get to as many people as possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how we feel. And we also don't care if there's copycats. Like, great. Like, this is just something that needs to have existed for many years now. So let's get the ball rolling somehow. We have a million ideas and other identified needs in the hopper. There's always more that we could be moving on to if someone else can then take this and take it to scale. More than we have capacity.
Please, by all means, copy what we're doing. Get these things out to everyone and find what works for you.
Exactly. Yeah, and if anyone wants to pick my brain on how to copy us, you can also email me. Again,
your email address is very public. Well, listen, I think I think what you're doing is really important, and you know, I think the past year and a half has kind of highlighted it's highlighted so many things. It's highlighted the need for empathy. It has certainly highlighted the need for social connectivity, and you know, showing kind of the underpinnings of how this can make us healthier, how it can make us happier, and in general how it can really kind of pick a lot of people up. I think that's super important. We can't thank you enough for spending time with us today. I have a feeling we're gonna blast this pretty far and wide on YouTube, because you know, even as we come out the other side of the pandemic, we don't want to forget what we went through for the last 18 months. And we certainly want to understand how we can help those of us who maybe aren't getting out of things quite as quickly as everybody else. So again, thank you so much for joining us. This is great. You know, everybody out there, thank you very much. Have a really terrific day, and we will see you again next week. All right. Thanks so much, Rose.
Thanks,
Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.